Good morning to all of you. Most of you have heard the great names of English romantics like William Wordsworth, like Coleridge, like Keats, like Shelley, and also Blake and Byron. Now, among all these romantics, George Gordon Byron, or Lord Byron, was perhaps the most controversial English romantic poet in history of English literature. I said the word controversial. Why? For multiple reasons. For his poetic career, for his political career, and also for his personal life. In fact, he was born at such a time when readers, especially common people, common intellectual people, used to interpret poetry or poetic persona in reference to the personal life of the author or the poet, which is not now. So when you confuse the persona, poetic persona, with the personality of the author, it becomes very difficult for the author to separate his own personal identity with the identity or form the identity of the poetic creations or persona that he had created. In fact, Byron's Childe Harold Pilgrimage, which I will introduce you to later, but before delving into Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, let us briefly introduce ourselves with Byron's life. Poet Byron was often confused with this poetic persona called Childe Harold. Why? Obviously, there were certain similarities of personalities, characteristics like cynical mood, melancholy nature, often can be found or were found within Byron's own personality. That's why Byron initially denied that his life resembled with the life of Childe Harold. But at the end of this text called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, he confessed that to some extent his own characteristic, his own personality resembled with that of Childe Harold. But this resemblance should not be considered as a matter of great importance while reading great art, while reading or interpreting great art or great poetry. We should consider each text autonomously, independently. Now, George Gordon Byron. Actually, his name initially was George Byron. He was born to John Byron. His father was often called John Mad Jack Byron because of his cynical, because of his insane, moody nature. So perhaps Byron himself inherited this moody nature from his own father. Now, he was the son of his second wife, of his father's second wife, Catherine. She was very eccentric woman with multiple sexual relationships. She used to spend and waste her money, inherited money. She was extremely rich. George later accepted the title of his maternal grandfather's title, Gordon. And later on he had to accept also the title Noel. And he had to sign his name as Noel Byron. It's very interesting that he signed his name as NB because initially in his young age he considered Napoleon Bonaparte to be his hero in his youthful age. And most of the romantics, as you know, were to some extent, at least initially in their life, were inspired by, influenced by French Revolution. Now Napoleon initially was a hero for him, but later on he realized that Napoleon was also a tyrann. He condemned Napoleon later in his life as a kind of fool, a kind of bastard Caesar. Now, talking about his personal life, Byron was also a kind of very eccentric, moody man. He wasted a lot of his money like his mother. He had multiple sexual relationships. He had both homosexual and heterosexual relationships. So he was a kind of bisexual. Multiple women, multiple men, young men came into his life. He cherished those relationships for a brief moment. He married Anne Isabel Milbank only for 1 year. Within 1 year, they got separated, divorced. And this event affected Byron's personal life extremely. And after this personal turmoil, personal relationship, he almost suffered a kind of mental trauma. And to overcome this, he went to travel across Europe. He decided to travel as that was the fashion of the time for young men, especially rich men, to travel across Europe to garner experience, achieve experience. Now, by the time he decided to go for a journey across Europe, Napoleon was already conquering and invading almost other northern parts of Europe. So he decided to start his journey from Portugal and Spain across Mediterranean Sea and to visit to Greece and Italy. Later on, these traveling experience, as we know, became the subject of Childe Harold's pilgrimage. He termed this traveling experience as pilgrimage. Now, when he returned to England and started to publish his works, controversy grew for different reasons, for personal reasons, for his sexual relationships with different persons, and also for political controversy. In fact, he objected to Lord Elgin's action to remove the Parthenon marbles, which were later called Elgin marbles, to be brought into England. He condemned this, he criticized this action. And because of this condemnation, criticism, a controversy erupted in Parliament, in British Parliament, about these Elgin marbles. Now, also people began to term Byron as anti-national, as a fool. But Byron did never mind those accusations or criticism. In fact, Byron was again and again criticized by London intellectuals, London reviewers. In fact, his text Hours of Idleness was criticized severely by some reviewers, and as a reply he wrote English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, a great work. But he tried to publish that anonymously. initially. But later on, when he published the first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, he became quite famous. And he said, I quote unquote, that I awoke one morning and found myself famous. So he found himself to be famous after composing the first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Gradually his poetic fame, in spite of his personal life, in spite of the turmoils and controversies around his personal life, he established himself as a romantic poet. And Childe Harold became the typical Byronic hero, which inspired later a lot of European poets, including the great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, who composed a great text called Eugene Onegin, which is in the model of the hero Childe Harold by Byron. In fact, the great English painter J.M.W. Turner also painted great landscapes based on Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. So you can understand how gradually Byron established himself in spite of a lot of political, personal controversies in England, in London. He established himself as a poet, as a romantic poet. Later on, we will analyze the text Childe Harold's Pilgrimage thematically, textually, and we will see why he is called a great romantic poet. Now, after establishing himself as a great English poet, as a great poet, he somehow felt extremely bitter, extremely harsh in London life. And he decided that he should leave again his country, England. And somehow he self-exiled himself out of England. And he vowed that he will never return to England again. So he went to Italy and Greece again. There in Italy, he had a brief friendship with P.V. Shelley, another great romantic poet. But this friendship didn't last long, as you know. Shelley often also criticized Byron for his cynical, misanthropic view about mankind, about society. But we know that they had a quite intimate friendship in terms of poetic career. When unfortunately Shelley was drowned, Byron attended his funeral. Now, all these things and also the personal setbacks that Byron had in his life at the time. At last Byron decided that he should do something useful, not just writing poetry. So he decided to go to Greece and fight for the Greece in their war of independence against the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. So, after a lot of hesitations and a lot of debates and controversy, he managed to sail to Greece and visited Greece. But there he found that the soldiers on the Greek side, they were divided. They are not united in their fight for liberation, in their fight for freedom. So he was quite disappointed. He tried to unite the Greeks against the Ottoman Turks. During 1823-24, he tried hard with his money, with his influence, to unite the Greeks in their fight for freedom. And somehow he decided that he would gather an army, build an army, and assault upon the Ottoman Empire. But before he could do that, he fell extremely ill. And ultimately, in 1824, I think it was in April, he died of this severe illness. Now, Byron never wanted to return to England because he felt so harsh, he felt so bitter about England, about English society, that he vowed never to return to England. And also, after his death, when the Greeks won their independence against the Turks, against the Ottoman Empire, they declared him to be a national hero. And that's why they wanted to preserve a part of their hero's body. And that's why Byron's heart was taken out after the post-mortem. And the Greeks kept that heart and sent the body to England. Again, when his body returned to England, again controversy broke out. The Westminster Abbey, the Poets' Corner, where all the great English poets were usually buried, the authority refused to bury his body there. At last, his body was buried in Nottinghamshire. Now, only in 1969, just a few years back, British government decided to place his marble statue, his marble sculpture at the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey as a gesture of justice to this great English romantic poet, who is also considered to be the Greek national hero. So after listening to this brief account of Byron's life, you must have a great reverence, great respect for this man. Although he was very controversial during his life, but he was extremely spirited, energetic young man who didn't want to waste his youth, waste his energy by just writing idly. He wanted to actively take part in revolution, actively take part in fight for freedom, for humanity, not just for Greeks. He stood for humanity. Although people mistook him as a misanthropic man. But if we analyze his text, analyze his poetry, we'll find that he's not at all a misanthropic man. The term misanthropic means those who don't believe in humanity, those who believe in positive aspects of humanity. But in fact, Byron was a believer. He believed that humanity would one day defeat all the evils of tyranny, all the evils of imperialism. Now, let us begin our introduction with Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is actually the core of this class. I just introduced you about Byron's life because Childe Harold, who is the protagonist of this text, is often confused with Byron's personal identity. In fact, this confusion between poetic identity and the personal identity had a long tradition, not only in English poetry, but also throughout European tradition. We find European poetry, European classical poetry, find this confusion between poetic persona and poetic personal identity of the poet. We should not confuse this. Now, this term, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, what does it mean? It means simply the pilgrimage, the traveling expedition, the holy voyage, holy journey of a man called Childe Harold. Now, the word child actually denotes someone who is going to be honored with knighthood. This is the first step of knighthood. So child connotes a man or a young man who is going to acquire experience in order to be knighted, in order to be a mature adult. Now this text, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, was dedicated to Ayant, a lady called Ayant. Actually, it was really a 12 or 13-year-old child, a girl called Hurley, Lady Hurley, Charlotte Hurley, to whom Byron dedicated this text. Now, it shows that at different times of his life, Byron was enamored by or was fascinated by different personalities like Lady Catherine Lamb, like Lady Charlotte Hurley, and also young men like John Hobhouse, with whom he also traveled across Europe. Now, what is the theme or the plot line of this text, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage? It's simply an account of experience of a long journey from, I think, 1809 or 10 to 1811 across Europe, starting with his journey in France, then Portugal, then Spain, then he avoided France, then to Switzerland, Greece, and finally also Italian places, famous Italian cities. All the 4 cantos were written about his experience, about his perception of the great places and great men. Whatever places he visited, in Spain, in Portugal, he was pained, he was feeling melancholy about the invasion by the French upon Spain and Portugal. He visited Italian cities like Ferrara, like Venice, and then also he visited the famous places like Parthenon, Colosseum, and he wrote about his perception about sculpture, painting, architecture. He wondered about those magnificent works of art by human beings. Now, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is not only about wondering and appreciation of these places and of these places of art. It also shows his appreciation of human ability. So the question of misanthropy should be treated with suspicion. Why? Perhaps it was a propaganda, a political propaganda to malign Byron, to condemn Byron purely for political and personal reason. Now, when he visited Italy, he also felt that human beings had the great ability to create great art. And this great art is great not only because it is artificial, but also because these arts or these monuments of art, these artifacts were inspired by nature. So as a great romantic, he believed that a perfect synthesis between nature and art would create great civilization, great human society. So he was much like Coleridge, who also believed that synthesis between nature and human art would inspire a great society, a great future, a great posterity for humankind. All throughout these 4 cantos, Byron through Childe Harold, condemned tyrannous, imperialistic human beings, imperialistic leaders like Napoleon, who was also initially a childhood hero for Byron, but he later criticized him as a kind of fool, a kind of bastard, who out of his ambitious nature, dominated other countries, dominated other societies. This is also the reason why he hated the Ottoman Empire upon Greece. He appreciated the Greek art, Greek culture. He also felt very pain, melancholy, when he realized that how a different culture like Turkish Ottoman, they were dominating and colonizing Greek culture, Greek art. In fact, for this reason, perhaps later at the end of his life, he decided to fight for Greece, for Greek freedom against the Ottoman Empire. Now, in my next class, I will concentrate only on Canto 4, because Canto 4 and some stanzas at the end of Canto 4, some stanzas have been selected for your study, for your thematic analysis in your syllabus. So in my next class, I will try to focus upon just one canto, that is Canto 4, with which Byron ends the Childe Harold's pilgrimage. And I will try to read out certain textual portions to justify the thematic analysis. So today, after this, if you have any queries regarding what I have said today, I just gave you a brief introduction to Byron as well as to Childe Harold's pilgrimage. Wait for the next class, because in that next class I will analyze thematically and structurally about Childe Harold's pilgrimage, which is written in Spenserian stanza and which is also inspired by Spenser's style. So wait for the next class. Have a good day.